Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to another podcast series organized by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities, where the voices of scholarships, advocacy, and justice coverage to shape inclusive futures. We are truly honored and privileged to have the company of one of Europe's most influential voices in the domain of legal pluralism, human rights, and minority protections. So thank you so much, Professor Eduardo Javier Ruiz Vieytez. I apologize if I've ever mispronounced your name. Professor Javier is a professor of law at the University of Vieytez, and he's also the former director of Vieytez Human Rights Institutions. So before we begin, we'll dwell into a couple of important questions. That's why this conversation is urgent. It's urgent because in South Asia, over 400 million people belong to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, many of whom face systematic discrimination, statelessness, cultural erasure, and according to Minority Rights Group's international report, that hate crimes and discriminatory legislation have increased across South Asia by 32% over the last decade. Meanwhile, I always, as a student of European studies, I always look at Europe as a model of lessons, right? So, meanwhile, the Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, it's a model of Europe that has pioneered, offers legal blueprints that could inspire transformative policies in South Asia. And to speak on this topic, once again, we are truly grateful for your company, sir. We will be talking on the Europe's legal framework for cultural pluralism, lessons for South Asia's minority discourse, where we will explore some of the important points that what European legal and policy models can teach us about managing diversity without marginalization, how minority autonomy, religious freedoms, and integration policies are framed under European law, and what role civil society, academia, and cross-border cooperation can play in protecting those who are too often silenced. So this episode marks a significant milestone for SARIM as we welcome you, sir, to our podcast platform for the first time ever. Your participation not only amplifies the transcontinental dialogue on minority rights, but also signals the importance of shared learning between Europe and South Asia. At a time where deepening social divides are rampant, this is more than an episode, it's a bridge between continents, ideas, and futures. So thank you so much, sir. Before we go on to our conventional question series, let me begin with asking about your journey. Please walk us through, as a legal advisor to the past ombudsman, to your leadership roles in academia and minority rights institutions across Europe. Could you begin by sharing with us what initially drew your attention to the intersection of law, cultural diversity, and minority rights, and how your experiences have shaped your outlook on legal pluralism? Over to you, sir.
Okay, good morning, good evening. Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this series. I'm very pleased to be here and talking with you and exchange ideas from one continent to another. And coming to the question, well, I was initially, I have a legal background, so I studied law at university, and then I started my working life in working for the Basque Ombudsman as a legal advisor, which means working on human rights in general, but in a particular specific institutional framework, which is the Basque Autonomous Region. And those human rights violations in the framework of the Basque public administration, which is to some extent limited in the sense that it's not all kind of human rights violations, but those who are in the domain of powers of the devolved regional institutions, let's say. So on the one hand, I was working on that domain, and in parallel, I was also working as a pro bono, so volunteer working on an NGO working with in favor of the human rights of the migrants arriving to the Basque Country. And in those moments, I'm talking about the 90s, there were not many migrants or immigrants in this region. And the big change, so by which we had to significantly raise in immigration, was around the year 2000. And then we started, there were very few people working in that field. So we started working in favor of the rights of the people coming here, normally either refugees, so political refugees, or obviously many people were looking for a better way of life, just looking for jobs, etc. And well, I was working in that field for a while, and when I came to the academia, I came to the university later, so I did my teaching, I still do my teaching and my research activities, etc. And we also decided to create a human rights institute. So in order to work in favor of human rights from the academia. Working for human rights from the academia means to research, to publish, sometimes to denounce or to make political statements in favor of particular rights, particular situations. And also teaching and creating programs to teach or to reflect about human rights of migrants, human rights of indigenous peoples, human rights of minorities, etc. So my interest on minorities, my interest on migration somehow merged into a more global field, which is what I would call diversity and human rights, particularly cultural, I would say cultural identity, diversity and human rights, which refers to diversity focused on religion, language, ethnicity, national identity. So these what I call strong markers of collective identities. So that's basically my field of research and activities. Sometimes we do more academical or theoretical research for academic publications. Some other times we also advise to the governments, in our case, government of Spain, government of the Basque Country, municipalities. And in the past also, I was lucky to collaborate with the Council of Europe in some specific so-called missions, but limited visits to different countries to try to encourage institutions or authorities to, for instance, to ratify some particular treaties or to implement them properly well. Treaties dealing with either the treaty you mentioned, so the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, but also, in my case, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, which is focused on linguistic minorities. And that's basically the line, my research lines and my activity so far.
Thank you so much for providing the comprehensive insights on how you begin your journey. It's a role model for people who are listening from our part of the world. And thank you so much, sir, for offering such services. And on behalf of SARIM, we wish you all the best for what you're doing. And we would love to collaborate perhaps on like mutual issues pertaining to raising concerns faced by minority groups, not only in your country, in your region, but also in our region as well. So thank you so much, sir. And moving on to our traditional questions. In your experience advising on minority rights, as you indicated, in both Western and Eastern Europe, what core legal and institutional mechanisms have proven most effective in terms of balancing cultural pluralism with national unity, and how might these be adapted to our part of the world, which is South Asian context, where state building and majoritarian rule is getting its root, like in the domain of politics, and it's getting dominance over here as well.
Yeah, well, from my experience, the most relevant element here is not the law in itself. So it's not the legal framework, as in many other aspects of life. The most relevant issue here is political attitude. So the conviction about what does it mean to protect human rights in general. So it is more a question of belief, or a question of ideas, values that should be assumed and adopted by everybody, but in particular by authorities, public authorities, than having, let's say, a perfect or a more developed legal framework. Because legal frameworks, legal documents may exist, but so many times, and particularly in the field of human rights, they are not properly implemented, or they are not respected. And we all know that at the international level, we don't have very efficient ways of enforcing law. Also, at the domestic level, many times we don't have efficient ways of enforcing law. So law in itself does not solve anything. Law is relevant. Of course, it's one of the elements of the game. So it's better to have a more developed legal framework than not having it, of course. But it's just one instrument among many others. But the main force is to change political attitudes, to change political mentalities, and to convince people about respecting human rights, and in particular minority rights, as being something which is positive, not because it is good for the minorities, but also because it is good for everybody and for the majorities, and it is very good for the development and welfare of the whole society. So, having said this, it is true that in Europe, we have some legal documents which do not exist in other regions of the world yet. But it's also true that they are not such a strong legal framework. So we have a couple of hard law instruments, so I mean treaties in the European arena concerning minority rights, but none of them have enforcing mechanisms, really very strong enforcing mechanisms. So we are still depending on the political will of the governments, on public opinion, on pressure. And the rest of the institutions and documents we have, they are either soft law or just institutions, mediation, etc. Of course, it is more developed than in other regions of the world, but it is not really a very hard law set of instruments. It's also quite limited. It's a step forward, but it's not sufficient to guarantee that minority rights are respected in Europe. And we are also suffering from this, we could say, backlash in human rights in general and in minority rights in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. You rightly pointed out on the attitude of political, willingness. So it depends on how you are willing to politically motivate, these rights. Given your previous experience, or your past experience with Council of Europe, and on religious pluralism, how do European states legally accommodate religious minorities while maintaining secular governance? What practical lessons could South Asian countries where religious identity often overlaps with political marginalization draw from European models?
Well, that's a very interesting issue and question. But the point is that Europe, even if it's more or less united within the European Union, but even the 27 countries of the European Union, each of them has a different context and a different, very deep legal and political tradition, with some significant differences, which to some extent correspond to the religious differences. So what is the dominant religious tradition has a significant influence in what is the response of the country to the religious diversity. And there are still some countries in Europe in which we have kind of not an official religion, but there is a special link with a particular religion and with a particular church. This is typical from some Christian Protestant countries, so countries with majority of Protestantism, Lutheranism in particular, or the UK, with this significant link between the monarchy and the Church of England, etc. And in the past, of course, in some Catholic countries as well, where there still remain some small countries in which we find this official relation between the Catholic Church and the country, but there are very, very small countries like Monaco and San Marino, etc., even in Malta. But some other countries like Spain or others, they recognize that the majority of the society belongs to one religious tradition. It also happens in Greece. Of course, the Eastern countries, they have closer relations with Orthodox, so-called Christian Orthodox churches, which are quite national. So, and in very few countries, really historically has been a balance or more or less balanced religious diversity. Countries like Germany or the Netherlands, Switzerland, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, they have been quite balanced countries in the sense that there are 2 or 3 traditions and none of them was majority. But for the rest of the countries, there has always been a traditional religion, so there is a majority. And now all countries in Europe which are democratic and they follow the elements of the rule of law, so they declare themselves to be neutral. So they have to be neutral countries in terms of religion. And at the same time, of course, they have to protect and guarantee one of the fundamental freedoms, which is freedom of religion, which is one of the fundamental human rights for all the countries. And in all the countries as well, it is clearly declared that there cannot be any discrimination based on religion, based on personal beliefs. Freedom of religion means freedom of practicing any religion and freedom from religion as well. So all these countries should be neutral and at the same time should guarantee the possibility to exercise this, to put in practice, to implement freedom of religion, which means, particularly for the minorities, that the states, so the public institutions, have to intervene and have to adopt positive measures in order to make possible for the minorities to practice their own religion in a proportionate way, as far as it is reasonable, adequate means, etc. But they have to do that. So neutrality of the state does not mean a total abstention in respect to religion. On the contrary, it demands collaboration, so dialogue with religious institutions and collaboration with religious institutions. In some countries, there is, also in Europe, there is kind of a prejudice against religion, which is due to the tradition, to all those long centuries in which there was one dominant religion, and sometimes this religion and the church was really linked with the power. So some countries reacted in what we call the anti-clerical perspective, and so they declare themselves to be laïc, which is fine. So laïc means neutral. But in some countries, and France is probably the most clear example, but also Turkey, other countries, they follow a policy which is to refuse any kind of collaboration with any religious association or institution. What I think is that neutrality does not mean refusing any collaboration. Religion, it is a socially relevant issue that has to be taken into consideration by public authorities as any other socially relevant issue. Public institutions do collaborate with other social institutions. They may be sport institutions, they may be even private companies, foundations, and all these collaborate with states, with public institutions, states, regions, municipalities, etc. And it is fine that they do collaborate as far as they pursue the collective good. So they look for politically correct global aims and good for the country, good for the society. So religious institutions should be considered in the same level with neutrality, but it is necessary that the public institutions do collaborate and do facilitate those groups which are in weaker situation, those groups which are normally they are minorities, because they have less possibilities, because sometimes the calendars, dress codes, many institutions, health system, educational system, they have been shaped by a cultural tradition which responds to a given religious tradition. So religious minorities need some accommodations to be made in the global framework in order for them to practice their own religion without any restriction. And that's the role of the state in a very global sense. So all public institutions, they do have to accommodate, they do have to modify the legal framework or the interpretation of the legal framework in order to make possible for all people from all religions to practice their own religions freely and as far as possible on equal terms, on equal opportunities.
Thanks so much, Professor Eduardo, for bringing this issue in a very brief manner. You've rightly pointed out it's the matter of acceptance, right? The religious minorities or any minorities needs to be accepted. And my other question basically, addresses or raises these concerns. You talk about the adaptability as well. There also countries have to be, adaptable in terms of accepting their physical, not only physical, but their cultural existence as well. So like many European countries, European frameworks emphasize minority participation in decision-making through consultative bodies or legal quotas. How effective are these in practices? And could similar approaches address the persistent of political underrepresentation of minorities in South Asia?
Well, yes, the ways of trying to accommodate minorities and make them participate in a political system, they are different. So there are different means, different ways of doing that, of facilitating that. And depending on the context of each country, and I would say of each minority situation, maybe some ways are better than others. So for some minorities, strong minorities, in the sense that they are densely populated in a given territory, Normally in Europe, it is used the territorial autonomy as a way of accommodating. So territorial autonomy as a mean of as a way of devolving power to a minority which becomes majority in a given region in which they have some powers. So they can be autonomous in following their own, protecting their own culture, etc., or at least equaling the culture with the culture of the majority. So this is territorial autonomy is quite well known way of accommodating diversity, and it is used in some countries, in the UK or in Italy or in other different countries. We find examples of this. But it works for some minorities, very strong minorities, strong in relative terms with other minorities, I mean. For other minorities and for other contexts, it is used to make the elements of the minority to be official of the country. So some countries declare more than one language official for the whole country in order to incorporate minorities on an equal level. So they don't need to have, let's say, consultative status because they already have their language, which is their main identity marker, as in the first level of the country. Let's say there's countries like Finland, the case in Ireland, or in other countries like, I don't know, Kosovo, which having different languages in the whole country, of course, Belgium, Switzerland, etc., for different regions. And in other cases, cultural autonomy can be a very good instrument to accommodate minorities when they don't have a clear territory, they are non-territorial autonomy, so they live in a whole country. So some level of cultural autonomy, which has been in practice in different European countries, Central and Eastern Europe. Cultural autonomy is a very interesting instrument, but also very delicate because it has to be very well used. Otherwise, it can be an instrument of discrimination, segregation, or other let's say other policies. But cultural autonomy, when the minorities are not present in a particular corner of the country, is relevant. And in this case, yes, you need to have some institutions in which minorities, these minorities, they do participate, they have their own representation, either consultative or in decision-making processes. So maybe there could be also some minimal quota. You can also use instruments like cross-community minimum majorities. So different elements that we can find in places like Northern Ireland or in the Cyprus Constitution and in other countries in Europe with cultural autonomy. And other countries, they do just reflect cultural rights in the Constitution for certain minorities. In all the cases, particularly in the last ones, having councils is always a good instrument, but obviously better if it's a decisive body, not consultative. Being consultative makes you weaker, of course. In some countries, I could say it works reasonably well, and in some other countries can be probably just a window or just a symbolic body with very, very, very little power. So depending on the context, it may have some sense to export or not to other countries outside Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched upon very critical points of territorial autonomy and the cultural autonomy, and how they are accommodated and needs to be accommodated. And you rightly said that the element of having the council is really important in order to address these questions. My next follow-up question is basically pertains to linguistic and cultural diversity, particularly in places like Basque Country. You did touch upon this issue. Offers an interesting case of decentralized cultural autonomy. Could such models inform more inclusive federalism in South Asia, especially in a multi-ethnic states like India, Pakistan, or perhaps Sri Lanka?
Yeah, in our case, this is really territorial autonomy model. So in the case of Spain, it is divided in so-called autonomous regions, autonomous communities. It's a clearly territorial autonomy model. So it is not defined by ethnicity or either language or religion. It's defined by territory. So it's an administrative belonging. But obviously, it is true that the Basque Country has an autonomy. The Catalonia also has an autonomy. So some regions with, let's say, very strong personality and their own different culture with different languages do enjoy territorial autonomy, which means that we have regional elections. So we have a parliament whose majority is totally different from the majority of the parliament of the state, of the whole country, of the national level. And this parliament has a government which can develop different policies, protecting better the regional culture, etc. So that's a way of trying to balance, protection of pluralism, protection of diversity with, as you said, unity, so belonging to the same country. Of course, this is not a happy solution for everybody, of course, because not in all moments, because there are some tensions. Obviously, there are tensions because some people would be in favor of something totally different, more advanced self-government. Some others would be in favor of the opposite. So, yes, territorial autonomy here is kind of midway. And then how territorial autonomy works, it's also subject to debate, of course. Some people demand that the whole country, so the whole state and nation, recognizes diversity in itself. So instead of having some regional official languages, no, let's have more than one official language in the whole country. So to symbolize that the whole country is plural. It's not that some regions are plural, but the whole country is plural. But that's another alternative, but we are not far from that at the national level. Of course, territorial autonomy is a way to accommodate diversity, but there are other ways to accommodate diversity, and you can combine the ways to accommodate diversity. And I think, as far as I know, which is my knowledge of your region is limited, but India or Pakistan are federal countries, so they already have a structure which is constitutionally complex with different levels of government that may be useful for accommodating at least one level of diversity, but also using cultural autonomy overlapping with territorial autonomy, I think is always good. And of course, again, changing mentality to try to understand minority rights as human rights, not the special rights, but the rights of everybody, but enjoyed in a different way or enjoyed through different identities. I think that's a very important point. So human rights must be enjoyed through the cultural identity of anybody, not in spite of his or her cultural identity, but through his or her cultural identity. So we are not talking about the special rights or extra rights or different rights. We are talking about civil liberties, fundamental freedoms, which have to be enjoyed, taking into consideration the language, religion, convictions, ethnicity of anybody. Because we, the people, we don't go out to the street without our language, identity, religion, etc. So it's our civil liberties, the civil liberties of everybody have to be adapted. And in that sense, of course, some constitutional changes in countries like Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan could be very useful. But again, the most important thing is try to change mentalities, to change political culture, to see diversity as a huge treasure, as a huge asset that the country has, and something which always helps for economic development, social development, and welfare. Because this is one point in which I always insist. It's not just a question of justice, which of course it is, but it's also good for any society. To be more diverse and to respect diversity has always been very productive, also in social and economic terms. And I think we have to repeat this message, because it is not just a question to be fair, which we have to be fair, but also to be intelligent.
Thank you so much, sir, for your comprehensive response on the importance and the issue of linguistic and cultural diversity, and how we countries with multi-ethnic states can learn or can be benefit from it. So lastly, in the light of I've been talking about this, the element of nationalism and majoritarianism, in growing nationalism both in parts of Europe and South Asia, how can legal frameworks safeguard minorities' rights without being perceived as a threat to national identity? What roles should civil society and academics like you and the institutions can play in this legal political balancing act?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we are living very difficult times, because working in favor of minorities has always been difficult, by definition. It's always difficult for a very simple reason. And we start from the point of view from the point of democracy. So we are talking about democratic countries. But in democracy, by definition, minorities are in the losing side always. So in democracy, we always need to convince the majority of protecting minorities. We need the votes of the majority. So for that reason, it's always difficult. That's one of the big paradoxes of democracy. Okay, But the quality of democracy depends on how majorities treat minorities. That's about quality. Democracy is not the rule of majority. Democracy is not the tyranny of majority. Democracy is about respecting minorities, respecting the rights of everybody, also by the majority. So it has always been difficult, but it's true that it's getting more and more difficult. And one main reason for this is that the way we communicate today, after internet was popular, and then now with social networks and the new ways of communication, so fast and so immediate, but also they also tend to polarize society, and they tend to make communication, paradoxically, to make communication less real, less efficient. So we all tend to be more and more in our own discourses, repeating discourses and narratives without confronting, without relating really with others. That makes more and more polarized society. And that's very good for state nationalism. The very dangerous nationalism is always the nationalism of the states, or from the state level, because it's the nationalism of the majority, which tends to understand the state as their own instrument. And the state, I know that the history has made the state product, political product, which has been, particularly in Europe, has been the nation state. And there is a tendency in all states in the world to create a nation or to create a national identity which is dominant and which is more or less homogeneous, and which obviously crosses all institutions, legal framework, etc. So what we need is to create or read plural states. So to bridge this equation of equality between one state, one dominant culture, one dominant identity. No, one state, if the state is necessary for our living, it's necessary because it's the way of polity we have in the world. Yes, but one state, many identities. One state, many ways of life. One state, diversity. So one state, big diversity. And diversity means different identities. We don't need to share cultural elements to be part of one state. And even to be patriotic, I would say. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to share cultural elements. And this is the big mistake that we repeat. Almost all states try to repeat. No, it's not necessary. You can create strong states without tensions inside, without imposing cultural elements of the majority to the minorities. Fortunately, we have some examples in the world, not many, but I always say that fortunately we have, in the middle of Europe, we have Switzerland. In Switzerland, there is no common language, and there is no common religious tradition. But Switzerland, so there is no Swiss language. But in Switzerland, there is a big sense of belonging. So it's a country in which a vast majority of the population is very proud to be part of Switzerland, and it's making of the flag and National Day and all national celebrations. So there is no separatism, there is no ethnic conflict inside, not significant tensions, and they don't have a common language. So which means that it's not necessary to impose a language. It's not necessary to impose religious tradition to make people be very happy of belonging to that country, or to be people very happy of putting the flag in the garden in the National Day, which doesn't happen in other countries in which we have a common language. So 99% of people speak the same language, but we have a strong sectors which want to become independent, or they have tensions, etc. So we have to create and consolidate the idea of plural states. So post-identitarian state, post-national state. So the state has to be an instrument of guaranteeing human rights in different ways, because we are plural and diverse. And also diversity brings economic development and social welfare. So we have to create states which are not monolingual, not monocultural, with many identities inside. The state has to become the framework for living together. Of course, we have to debate about limits. We always have to debate about limits, values, human rights. Obviously, all rights have limits. We have to make debates, dialogue, but this has to be a never-ending dialogue, a permanent debate of the limits, because the limits also of human rights, the most basic human rights, these limits, they change, they evolve, they change in time, they change in context for different generations. So we have to adapt to a new era in which we don't have a prefixed frameworks where all, let's say, tensions, all problems are solved. We have to adapt to a never-ending debate and dialogue of difference to create a political community. Because what is important here is that the political community, the state, the city, the region, etc., the political community is composed by all people who wakes up in this particular country every day. And we may come from this very place, from generations, or maybe we came from other countries. But we are already here. We work here. We try to work here. We pay taxes here. We are part of this political community. We have to participate in this political community. And this political community has to benefit from our presence. We are all part of this political community, so we have to be all part for this political debate, which will fix the limits to human rights every day, but listening to everybody, opening the state. The states have to be opened, have to be widened. And in that sense, how to be successful in with this narrative? Well, it's difficult, of course, but we have to insist. We have to show politicians, we have to show those who have the responsibilities that these policies are more effective and more respectful of the human rights framework. So more democratic and more legitimate from a political perspective. And we have to insist, we have to find a ways to convince people of what is good for the future. And if we have to use the social networks, we have to use new technologies, we will have to learn to do it.
Thank you so much, Professor Eduardo, for your comprehensive insights over this discourse today. Firstly, we are truly grateful for you for offering your valuable time on this topic. You've talked about your commitments and your experience with Council of Europe and how you handled these issues of religious nationalism, pluralism, and the issues of territorial identity versus cultural identity. You have touched upon very briefly over the approach towards national linguistic and cultural diversity. You have categorically walked us through the participation of the participation of minorities in decision-making process. And lastly, I do have a last question, if you allow me to proceed with this question. That you said that the minorities have to rely over the decision making of the majorities, right? So, are they why they become very compulsive in terms of reacting? Is there their compulsiveness, or does that have to do with the fear of their existence?
No, what I mean by relying on the majority means it's because democracy works like that. So in democracy, majority rules. It's the majority who decides. So it's the majority who can decide, at least theoretically, who can decide what is the official language. So it's, in principle, seems to be difficult that the majority decides that the official language is going to be one of the minorities. Mm-hmm. Yes, so we need the will of the majorities in order to, for instance, to make a minority language official. So we need that not only minority speakers vote in favor of that, because we don't have sufficient votes with that. We need votes from the majority. So in that sense, we rely on majorities because democracy works like that. And then it's very important to talk to the majorities. It's very important to make majorities understand that this is not an issue. Minority is not an issue of minorities. Minority is an issue of the whole society, and in particular, I would say, of majorities. So this majority many times has to move a little bit, has to adapt. And of course, we are all lazy, and we are all we don't like changes when we are very well consolidated in one place. But many times with a little change, then we understand. After the change, we understand we earned a lot, and it was a very good idea to move. So in that sense, the minorities, of course, they have to work also themselves. They have to organize, and they have to look for their own goals. But also they rely on majorities because we work on democratic frameworks in which you need to be in dialogue, and you have to convince the majority that it's better for them also to try to follow your program. So that's the big task.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, sir. I mean, lastly, if you were to rate any top three nations which are your favorite in terms of adopting cultural or pluralistic approach towards their minorities, what would be those countries?
Sorry again, I missed your point.
Yeah, I'm asking that if you were to rate any top three nations or any top three countries which are adopting the cultural pluralism to its core.
Well, it's very difficult to answer that question, because as soon as you answer that question, you put these top countries, and then, of course, I can mention some countries, but at the same time, I can mention the difficulties and shortcomings of these countries as well. And also, it depends on the context again. So the merit depends on many things. But having said that, well, I would mention, on the one hand, Canada. You can mention Canada for different reasons, but I would say at the same time, Canada has many problems. One of them is with the First Nations. So really, really acknowledging the role of the First Nations, for instance, in Canada and other countries. Countries in South America, like, well, I will mention Finland, I will mention Switzerland, or even the UK, but not with many difficulties as well, because some elements of them are example for others. But of course, in each of them, there have been big problems, and one of the big problems now in almost all countries in Europe is the relation with migrant communities in all of them. So, well, but I already said a list of countries for you.
Thank you so much, Professor Javier, for your profound time and value that you've given to our discourse. So on this very note, we would like to thank you once again, and to our listeners, those who are watching us. And it would be a very insightful discussion for those who are working on the issues of minorities, cultural diversity, and pluralism, the idea of denouncing hate as well. So on this very note, I would like to conclude this session. And thank you so much, sir, for your time. Until next time, we'll see you together.
Thank you very much to you.